Hi everyone, in this video I will be talking about human rights and philosophy. Firstly, I will talk about how the philosophy on human rights has developed over the past centuries, and then I will go over some of the important philosophers and their viewpoint on human rights. Plus, I will try to explain briefly how they contributed to the modern perception of human rights. Lastly, I will talk about the current situation and what challenges human rights are facing, and I'll be focusing on whether we can consider human rights to be universal or not. Let's start at the beginning. For centuries, the philosophy of human rights was based on natural law. Human rights would be innate to people for the sole reason that they were human beings. So, this means that you and I and everyone in our class is entitled to human rights because we are human. A famous philosopher that supported these ideas is Thomas van Aquino, for example. The idea of human rights is rooted in the conception that all human beings share something very important, namely dignity. And what we see is that dignity is also a very important and inherent concept to world religions like Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, but also humanism that emerged in ancient Greece. And the concept of dignity ties into principles of democracy, equality, duty, and freedom, and that is exactly what human rights are about. Later, in the 20th century, the view on HR became more pragmatic. Instead of merely being regarded as rights we have because we are human, they were now considered essential for a society if this society did not want to suffer from violence and arbitrariness. Now let's dig into that change a little bit deeper that can be traced all the way back to the 17th century. We know that from this moment the idea of a social contract resonated, which saw ownership as a basic right. The social contract was developed by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, among others. Hobbes explained his political philosophy in Leviathan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But he said that everyone is watching the weakness of others to take advantage of this, and therefore had the quote, "Man is man or wolf." However, according to Hobbes, there are natural laws, that make a rational man see that he must comprise his freedom in agreement with others, or restrict his freedom in agreement with others. So now let's talk about Locke, who has also contributed significantly to the emergence of both liberalism and the modern idea of human rights. So Locke believed that in the natural state, all people are born free, equal, and they're not subjected to any authority. According to Locke, the king does not have a divine right. Rather, everyone has the right to live, to freedom, property, and health. However, Locke does believe that there must be some form of authority, which he describes as a social contract in order to keep the peace. Locke says that a civil society replaces the natural state. The basic rights of life, liberty, and property formulated by Locke have been incorporated into the United States Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. So what we can take away from this, and how Locke has changed the perception on human rights, is that he was one of the first ones, and it was a pretty extraordinary idea at that time, to say that every person is equal, so everyone must be treated equally. And he went even further to say that people have the right to live, and the right to freedom, and the right to property and health. And like I said, that was pretty extraordinary at the time. And then lastly, I would like to briefly talk about Rousseau, who was also a very important philosopher during the Enlightenment period, and he believed, in contradiction to Locke, that a man's nature is actually pretty good, but that it is corrupted by culture. And so he said, in a treatise on the social contracts, that a society is an expression of the general will, and thus of the community. However, he did say that those who oppose this may be forced by the majority to do something they might not want or might not choose to do. In the 19th century, the idea of human rights came under pressure from socialism and communism. By emphasizing on individual rights, the ruling class would only want to safeguard its traditional rights and advert to the revolution. In the 20th century, various movements developed that no longer had natural law as a starting point. Among them was, for example, existentialism, with Jean-Paul Sartre as its known leader or biggest thinker, which states that a man has been thrown into the world and must live with the fear and uncertainty that this entails, and that civilization must be based on humanist principles such as trust and sincerity. So now that we have followed the timeline all the way to, the time we live now, I would like to highlight two familiar philosophical worries about human rights, which is one, that they are based on moral beliefs, and that they are culturally relative, and that their creation and advocacy involve ethnocentrism. So human rights prescribe universal standards in areas such as security, law enforcement, equality, political participation, and education. But the peoples, the countries, their cultures vary enormously, and especially in their practices and beliefs. So putting these two propositions together may be enough to justify the worry that human rights do not sufficiently accommodate the diversity of the world and its people. And a theoretical expression of this worry is relativism, which is the idea that ethical, political, and legal standards for a particular country or region are mostly shaped by the traditions, beliefs, and conditions of that country or region. And I think there's a lot of examples all of us could think of where, there's a very clashing viewpoint on whether something is a human rights violation or not. And we can think about child marriage, we can think about FGM, or I can think of many actually where I think most of us would say that it is wrong. However, there's many culture where it's so deeply rooted and where it is not considered wrong at all. So that's, I think, a big challenge for human rights in the future. And are they instead, can we see them as something universal, or are they historically shaped, or can they still change, or are there exceptions? And that is a difficult question to answer, and I don't think I'm going to do that in this presentation, but it is interesting to think about, and I hope you think that too. So to conclude, human rights have changed enormously over the past centuries, and the conception and the perception of people towards human rights has changed, and it is very important that we keep thinking about it, because human rights have the ability to keep people safe and happy. However, big challenge is to consider whether human rights can be considered universal, or if there should be a more relativist approach to them.